Good afternoon and good evening from all around the world. Welcome to the Dialogue of Continents 2020 online. This is day one of the 3-day series, and today's topic is towards a new geopolitical order. Session three, the specific topic is about the long term impact of COVID 19. My name is Howard Chang, and it is really my honor and privilege to have the opportunity to be the moderator for this exciting panel discussion. I'm the Vice President of Global Affairs at TCSA, and I'll quickly introduce each of our panelists today. The first one up is Professor Venky Venkateswaran. He's the Associate Professor of Economics at the Stern School of Business at New York University. And the second up is Mr. Lei Ding, the Senior Community Development Economic Advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And the last but not the least, Mr. Benjamin Pring, the co-founder, and managing director of Cognizant. So how it's going to go today is as follows. We have 60 minutes in total, and each speaker will have 10 minutes to present your materials without interruption. After that, we'll have 15 minutes for a Q&A and a final 5 minute for wrap up. I'll say a few words about the pandemic before I hand the floor over to Venky. Right before our session, I looked up the latest statistics on the situation of the pandemic right now. And unfortunately, the death toll today, according to WHO, up to today, November 4th, 2020, the confirmed cases worldwide has reached 47 million people. And the total death today, total death is 1.2 million. If we just take a moment to ponder and consider the extraordinary number of confirmed cases and deaths, we might have been numb to these daily changing numbers for the past few months. But if we just take a moment to consider, that is a lot of lives interrupted, a lot of families impacted, a lot of people that we have lost forever due to this disease, due to this infection virus. So that's on the health front. But in terms of economic impact, the stock markets worldwide at the lowest level have really, Nikkei has hit minus 30%, Dow Jones Industrial Average minus 35%, FTSE minus 35% as well at the lowest point during the pandemic. And unemployment also has rises sharply all around the world. Japan all the way up to 3%, Germany to 3.9%, UK 4.8%, Canada to 7.5%, and France, the US around 10%, and Italy to 12.7%. These are extraordinary numbers and almost near wartime situation. So it is a grave topic, but it's also a hopeful subject because we get to explore not only the recent past, but the long-term future and the long-term impact of COVID-19 and how, in fact, we can work together through a forum such as a dialogue of continents to get ourselves out of this situation. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Professor Venky, please.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this panel. I'm especially grateful that I don't have to stare at the news this morning, so this is perfect timing. So what I'm going to do in my time is to kind of walk you through a recent paper that's joined with Laura Wellkamp and Julian Kozlowski at the St. Louis Fed, and the usual disclaimer applies, where we kind of take a step back and think about what the longer term implications are. And when I say longer term, there's obviously a lot of discussion about what the impact is going to be in 2020 and in 2021. What we want to do, we don't have a crystal ball for that, and we are not really, a new forecast is not what we are after here. What we want to try and do is to kind of think about different scenarios, and in those different scenarios for 2020 and 2021, what the longer term economic effect of the pandemic would be. And the perspective we're going to develop is this idea of belief scarring. And belief scarring is just this intuitive idea that when you go through an experience, especially one as profoundly disturbing as this one, as Howard just kind of laid out, it kind of sticks in people's memories. It sticks in people's beliefs, and that belief, that changed belief, is going to have lasting effects on economic outcomes. So this is a machinery, and this idea we developed in the context of the the global financial crisis and the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. And in some sense, we were kind of trying to explore how that might help us think about the pandemic and its long-term effects, right? So I think that's that's the goal over the next few minutes. So the basic idea, as I just said, is we are after channels through which the economic effects of the pandemic would last even after the disease is contained. For example, even after the vaccine comes along, or even after we have kind of somehow brought it under control. So there are probably two channels. One is the belief scarring channel, which is what I'm going to spend a lot of time on. But that's intimately linked in our kind of framework to what I'm going to call capital scarring. And the capital scarring is the idea that there are this investments made in the past which have been rendered somewhat permanently, or at the very least persistently, less productive as a result of this pandemic. A great example of that is, you have a restaurant, you've had relationships with many people to supply stuff to your restaurant. The pandemic and the lockdown stretches on for several months. You lose a lot of suppliers. You lose a lot of kind of these relationships. So the restaurant that you still have it. It's just less productive. So that's a very simple kind of intuitive example, and this idea extends more broadly to the overall economy, which is where, because the disruption here is a rather kind of involved and sophisticated one. So those are the two channels I'm going to kind of emphasize. And the idea here is both of these channels are going to have effects that are quite long lasting, but the belief scarring one is going to really last well beyond this. And we're going to write down a model and kind of talk about this through the lens of the model, where we'll find that the effects of belief scarring could be could be substantial and could last for decades as a result of this. And I think I just want to give you a flavor of that idea here, and then we can get into more during the Q&A. So the point I want to make is that this long-term effect could be an order of magnitude higher than the effect in terms of lost economic activity in 2020 or 2021. Right. So here's kind of the very rough idea of the belief distribution. So think about this. What I'm plotting here is a probability distribution. The prior is what we had before the pandemic, and the posterior is what we had after the pandemic. So the actual object is a little bit more complicated, but think of this as returns to investing or returns to capital. So the two panels here are two scenarios, scenario 1 and scenario 2. In scenario 1, the shutdown is much more aggressive and there's a lot more capital kind of disruption that's happening. Scenario 2 is a milder one, where if you want to roughly think about it, this corresponds to a GDP loss of about 10% in 2020. This corresponds to a GDP loss of about 5% in 2020, roughly speaking. And so what you see is after the pandemic, the distribution kind of adds a little bit of mass. The red dashed line on my screen here adds a little bit of mass in the left tail. That's a sense in which beliefs have become a little bit more pessimistic as a result of having observed this event. If the pandemic, if you're in scenario 2, the same thing happens, but it's much less to the left. So it's not as bad as it was, but there is still some pessimism that's corrected. So that's the idea behind the two scenarios. And then you kind of pass this through a pretty standard kind of economic model and evaluate its effects. And you get this is the time path, this is a simulated time path for GDP over the next several decades. And as you can see, Early on in the pandemic, this gray area, which is the immediate effect of the pandemic, lasts. And this lasts because capital has been kind of destroyed or rendered obsolete in a way, and it takes a while for the economy to kind of make its way back. But absent belief scarring, the economy eventually would go back. It might take a little bit of time, but it'll eventually go back. But as it does that, the effects of belief scarring serve to keep output depressed for several years. And so in scenario one, GDP is about 4% lower, almost in perpetuity once even after the pandemic has gone back. In scenario two, that effect is about maybe 3 or 2.5. But again, the same idea that especially over the long term, the belief scarring channel kind of dominates. And it's much bigger if the expected discounted value of that is much bigger than the effects we are kind of trying to stall here. And so the policy kind of angle here is to say, to the extent that policy can intervene and make the pandemic less costly in terms of capital obsolescence, you could substantially shrink, or you could try to shrink this orange area on the slide. And the benefits of doing that are not just that you're going to kind of get back GDP in 2020 and 2021, but you're also going to have a longer term effect on the economic activity. So if you think about a payoff of trying to intervene and keep firms from going bankrupt or preventing a mass chain of bankruptcies, the payoff here is not that you're going to get more economic activity in 2021, but that you have made people less pessimistic for a long time to come. And so that's the policy message from this. The last theme I want to kind of end with, so this is a time path for investment with and without scarring. And this is the idea that belief scarring deters risky investment. And that's what underlies the economic losses that I showed here. The last theme I want to do is you can kind of use the model to think about what's going to happen to interest rates. And the model, because as people become more pessimistic, safe assets become much more valuable and desirable. And the effect of that is also very high. And so in our baseline model, the prediction for how low the negative effect on a riskless interest rate is substantial. It's as much as 60 something basis points. So, in a sense, to the extent that monetary policy authorities are going to try and think about their longer term strategy here, this could be a rather powerful force dragging interest rates, at least on safe assets, even lower going forward. And so that's the last theme I want to leave you with. And I'm happy to kind of take questions about this in the Q&A. Thank you so much, Howard.
Great, thank you, Venky. Right on the mark.
Perfect. Okay.
I mean, it's perfect. Thank you. Next, we'll have Mr. Dean. Please share with us your view from the Federal Reserve Bank's of Philadelphia's perspective. I realize it's not the official stance; it's your personal sharing, but we are very curious to hear from you. Thank you.
Can you see, I think, the slide? I just want to confirm.
Yes, very clearly.
Okay, great. Thank, I think, the organizer, I think, for having me here. I'm Lei Ding from Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. It's my great pleasure to present a recent report that we released on automation. Slightly different, I think, from Venky's presentation. Actually, I think we focus on the short-term impact of the automation on jobs during the pandemic. Of course, I hope the results will have some implication on the long-term effects of COVID-19. Before I think discussing the results, I just want to mention the standard disclaimer: the views expressed here are my own. Do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. Okay. Let me see. Oh, yeah. Oh. Sorry, has some technical difficulty. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Great, we can see now. Yeah.
You can see? Yeah, okay.
Oh, wait, we lost it again.
Lost again. How about this? Sorry. Yeah. For decades, I think in the US economy has seen increasing automation in industries ranging from manufacturing to food service and also to office work. From this chart, as you can see from 1980s, lots of routine jobs, which can be performed by following well-defined set of procedures. And as a result, I think can be relatively easily to be automated, had happened almost entirely during recessions. The job losses in routine occupations during the previous 3 recessions were largely substituted by technology. We call it, I think, generally we're leading to jobless recoveries. Of course, I think the COVID-19 crisis has caused severe job losses, and with record unemployment rate, while some sectors I think have recovered quickly, for other sectors, COVID-19 will have long-lasting effects. So that's why people are also concerned whether COVID-19 has accelerated the process of automation as well. Yeah. Okay. Such a concern is not groundless. Anecdotal evidence from news reports suggests that employers substitute workers with robots and software that are unlikely to be affected by the pandemic. For example, in the state where I live, the state of Pennsylvania, in June 2020, the state laid off 500 toll collectors after the interstate system temporarily went cashless in response to COVID-19. And similar examples can be found in meatpacking factories where robots were adopted to prevent workers from getting infected, in hotels where human front desk workers were replaced by self-check-in kiosk, and in retail stores where sales representatives were replaced by the increased adoption of e-commerce. There are tons of these kind of examples. We argue that there are at least 3 primary channels through which the pandemic could accelerate automation in the short term. First of all, although I think not all initial job losses were driven by automation, machinery and software often become more attractive than hiring the displaced workers during the recovery. The example I just mentioned, the layoff of toll collectors is such example. And even I think there is increased demand in certain occupations, constraint on labor supply, incentivize firms to use technology to substitute for workers. The increased demand for robots in meatpacking factories or disinfecting robots in hospitals and grocery stores are such examples. Furthermore, like the previous recessions, the COVID-19 crisis reduces the adjustment costs associated with automation, which are often very high during booming period, and making it easier for firms, not necessarily in those hard-hit sectors, to replace workers by readily available technology. Yeah, just give you a preview of the finding from our report. Based on our nationally representative employment data set for the US, we find that the pandemic has accelerated automation by leading more job losses in automatable occupations, exposing these jobs at a high risk of being permanently automated. During this process, minority workers were especially harmed by automation. And we also found that losses of automatable jobs could become permanent, similar to what happened during the recovery from the recent recessions. And also all these, I think, trends will have important policy implications, creating unprecedented need for the government intervention to prepare for future job relocation. And here's, I think, the major results I think we find. We find that the pandemic has led significantly larger job losses in technically automatable jobs. Empirically, we compared the monthly employment or occupations with different level of automation risk with their pre-crisis level in January 2020. By September, automatable occupations lost about 3.9 more jobs per 100 than low-risk ones. That's equivalent to about 2.4 million pre-crisis jobs. Of course, I think not all of these jobs have been fully automated, but obviously these automatable jobs that had not come back already 7 months into the recovery bear a high risk of being permanently automated. This chart illustrates the relation between the probability of automation and the extra job loss rate. There's a generally weak correlation between these two. Automatable jobs generally experience a larger job losses rate than the low risk ones. Just give you some examples of these technically automatable jobs that also experience larger job loss rates. For example, like the hotel desk clerks, shuttle drivers, retail salesperson, highway maintenance workers, food servicers, dishwashers, parking attendants. All these, I think, they have a high risk of being automated. Of course, I think the pandemic lead, I think, more job losses even I think in occupations with a lower automation risk. And just that's, I think, due to factors other than automation, just like the social distancing measures or business lockdown mandates. These are some of these occupations, for example, like the musicians, singers, physician assistants, tutors, they experience large job losses as well. But I think it's likely that their job loss is not due to automation directly. Which jobs I think are at higher risk of permanent automation? We suspect that the automatable jobs that do not allow remote work, those jobs carry a high risk of virus transmission, or in certain hard-hit sectors, they bear the highest risk of being permanently automated. And across different subpopulations, we find that the pandemic has put more minorities at elevated risk of automation. This could be explained by their automation mix, I would say, because minority are generally more likely to work in hard-hit service sectors like cashiers, food service employment, and maybe customer service representatives. Just give you a few examples. Of course, I think our study focuses on the short-term effects of automation of jobs in early stage of the pandemic only. But when we compare the trend during the pandemic with what happened during the Great Recession, we find that so far, the gap between the automatable jobs and the low-risk jobs during the pandemic is slightly narrower than what happened, I think, during the Great Recession. But I think if the pandemic, the COVID crisis evolves into a prolonged economic crisis, some of these losses could become permanent, as what happened, I think, in the previous recession. In the long term, even after the pandemic, we suspect that the pace of automation may be temporarily blunted by the labor supplies. However, I think we also suspect that firms are unlikely to entirely unlearn the labor-saving innovations or automation technologies that they adopted during the pandemic. For example, the massive technological transition into the virtual world could induce more automation, right? Just give you some example, just increase in telework. Now I think almost 1/3 of workers in the US are still working from home. And one study by Stephen Davis at the University of Chicago and his co-authors suggest that the share of workers who work partly or primarily from home were substantially greater than it was pre-crisis. The estimate is likely to be triple. And also, I think there is a significant increase in e-commerce in the US. and a significant increase in adoption of online education, telemedicine. All these trends I think mentioned above likely make many of the labor-saving innovations adopted during the pandemic permanent, and may put many previously safe occupations at risk of automation. That's, I think, what I want to cover here. And if you're interested in the full report, you can download from our website. Thank you. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lei Ding. Very, very interesting statistics showing the automation of jobs and also borrowing from Venky's terminology, the scarring effect of these psychological impact. Even when job markets return to normal, many of the jobs may not come back. Next, we'll have Mr. Benjamin Pring. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Howard. And thank you, Mark, for inviting me to the session today. I'm delighted to be back with you. Shame it's not in person in Paris, but hopefully another time, next time we'll be together rather than on Zoom. Howard, I'm not going to share any slides. I'm just going to talk, if that's okay, about 3 or 4 things which I think are extremely important, which I think do have long-term consequences, implications, dynamics that we can see in the marketplace. We've written quite extensively about this at the Center for the Future of Work at Cognizant, and a lot of our thinking is freely available up at our website. So please do have a look at that. And I'm going to start building on what Lai was just talking about, this increasing digitization of the world. And I think our underlying assumption, of course, disclaimer, we're a technology company, a technology consulting company, so we have a vested interest, clearly. But our underlying working assumption for now and going forward is that everything that can go online is going to go online. And if you step back from that thought and unpack it a little bit, you may think that we live in a very technological world already. Clearly, we're meeting over the cloud, over Zoom right now. And clearly, all of us have worked in the information age, the information revolution. The first commercial computer, the ENIAC, has just celebrated its 74th birthday. All of us have lived in a technological world. We've all made our careers and our ways in the world in a technological world. But the truth is that technology in very important pillars of society, in healthcare, in education, in financial security, in governance, has only really scratched the surface of those pillars of society. If somebody came back to our world today from 100 years ago and went to see a doctor today, they would completely recognize that experience. It hasn't changed particularly significantly. Technology is on the edge of how that important part of our society works. Fast forward, because of COVID, because of what's going on now, technology is going to be completely central to that experience. And in another 5, 10, 20 years, that person from 120 years ago, if he came back or she came back, wouldn't recognize the experience, because it's going to become completely mediated through technology. Technology tools are going to completely change the way that process works and the results that we can generate from it. Many of you perhaps have had a telehealth experience recently. Rather than going to see a doctor, you've had a consult over your phone or over the computer. And that's just an example, a beginning example of ideas that have been around for a while, nothing particularly new in that, but haven't been central to medicine, now becoming central to medicine. And I think you can say the same and extrapolate that idea into all sorts of areas, including, as Lai was just talking about, education. A further addendum thought to that is don't imagine that the online experience you're having today, that your kids are having in schooling or college, or you're having in that telemedicine experience, don't imagine that that's what it's going to be like in 5 years or 3 years. There's a huge explosion of innovation in the experience, in the capability and the functionality of the tools that we're going to use, which are going to completely change that, upgrade it. And I think in this online diffusion that we're all going to experience, this online digitization becoming central to everything, we're going to find that things become cheaper, faster, and better, we would argue. The second thought, Howard, I'd like to introduce is the impact of what's going on now in terms of travel, and then more broadly into globalization. I think this is a very profound moment in which we're going to assess, reassess as individuals, as business people, as citizens, just how we've been moving around the world. And I think, and Mark, this may pain me because I loved being in Paris with you a couple of years ago, that we're going to change the gestalt. And whereas prior to COVID, it might have been, one of my neighbors said, oh, you went to Paris for a meeting, how cool. Now it's going to be, you went to Paris for a meeting, how could you? And I think that's a profound change, which seems perhaps trivial, but I think is a profound change in changing our thoughts and our attitudes towards travel. Somebody who I spoke to recently, a CEO of a very large multinational organization, said that he thought that this was the death of the single business meeting trip, that he wouldn't any longer go for one meeting to Paris or to Sydney or to Sacramento from New York. You wouldn't go for one meeting in the way that, frankly, a lot of people have done, because we're all experiencing the fact that we can just, through tools like this, meet with our clients, meet with our colleagues, we can sell, we can service through this tool. And a lot of senior people, again, people I work with and I deal with quite regularly, are actually quietly at the moment, but I think increasingly forcefully going to say, I actually prefer this. The impact on wear and tear on me personally, the ability to talk to 5 or 6 different clients in different parts of the world in a day, to be at home for dinner with my kids in the evening, I think that's pretty significant. And again, this digitization enabled by tools like this is going to change the way we think about traveling and being in the world. I think the macro implication of that is that we're going to see a relocalization of a lot of focus up and down the supply chain. The notion that we have partners on the other side of the world and we routinely fly to see them, I think that's going to wither. I think that's going to decline. Of course, not completely. I wouldn't go that far. But I think on the edge, on the margin, it's going to change the way we think about moving around the world and make us focus on things closer to home. The third thing I'd say, Howard and Mark, is the impact that that and the first point I made on digitization has on how we think about the office, the place that most of us work. There's obviously a lot of talk in the media about, is the office dead? What do we need offices for in the future? And I think the reports of the death of the office are greatly exaggerated. The office isn't dead, the city isn't dead, but I do think the suburban commute is dead. And I do think we're going to reinvent the role of the office, what the office is for. And I think that reinvention is going to see a bifurcation of the role and the purpose of the office between, on the one hand, it being a showroom, and on the other hand, it being an R&D lab. And everything in between, all of the administration, all of the legal, HR, finance, coding, all of the middle between those two parts is going to be spread out into the world, to India, to Indiana, or to people's homes. Because what we're experiencing, and many of you may be experiencing at the moment, is that heads down work, where you're looking at your keyboard, filing your expense claim, coding, writing, sending messages. We're all doing that fine from home. We can do that anywhere. But heads up work, where we want to look at the whites of each other's eyes, we want that sort of creative tension of collaborating, of innovating, that type of work is done best together, not on this type of platform. So that work becomes part of the way we use the office for R&D, to cook the secret sauce for whatever business we're in. And the other role is when we want to impress a client with our office in Hudson Yards or in Canary Wharf or in La Défense or wherever it may be, where we want to show these people that we're serious and credible. I think that's going to be a profound reimagining of the spaces that we work in the next few years. And the notion that post-COVID, with a vaccine, with a therapeutic, we all go back onto the trains, we all go back into the office, we all sit in our cubicles like we used to do. I don't buy that. I don't think that genie is going back into the bottle. One final thought, and then I'll pause, Howard and Mark, is that I think the big takeaway I have for what we're going through, what we've gone through, what we're going through at the moment, is that there's been a huge failure at an institutional, societal, business, organizational level to really be able to do sophisticated risk assessment planning and analysis. I think what we're seeing is the failure of people to plan, understand different scenarios of worst case scenarios. And what we're doing in the panic, in the media-driven panic of this moment, is dealing with the short-term scenario and not the longer-term scenario. And of course, a lot of people are beginning to talk about the fact that the cure may be worse than the disease at the moment. And I think that's a structural problem, been evident to some people for some time, that's being exposed by what we're going through. And I think the consequence, I hope, and I hope this isn't naive to imagine this, but I hope the long-term consequence of this is that institutions, organizations take that scenario planning, that risk assessment planning much more seriously, deploy higher class people to do that, so we don't make bad trade-offs going forward, and we don't live hostage to the next virus, which obviously will emerge at some time. So I'll pause there and send it back to you, Howard.
Great. Thank you very much, Benjamin, for your thoughtful and insightful comments. At this point, I would like to open up for Q&A and discussion. Before I give my specific questions based on everyone's presentation, I would like to see if all three gentlemen have any questions for each other or feedback or comments. I think this is a very warm and safe place for us to share and discuss openly. So please, if you just raise your hand, then I can see. Okay, Venky, please.
So I had a very quick question for Benjamin, and I'm sure he's thought about this. So, as you said, over the last several months of doing this new form of work has been a learning experience for all of us. And part of what we learned is that, there's a class of activities which, could be done very efficiently and very effectively at home. Or like remotely, not at home, remotely. So I'm very sympathetic to that. But I also, and this is partly me introspecting, we've also learned that, I learned the value of what I'm going to call casual social contact that workplace environments offer us. So even if let's say I'm a person whose job is mostly head down job. So there's no productivity gains of me being in Hudson Yards. But, my experience of work is profoundly shaped by, the casual conversations, which have perhaps nothing to do with work. Maybe they have something to do with work. of those kind of things. And I think that's something which I suspect it would be a moderating influence to the trends that you mentioned. So unless we figure out another way, some substitute for that we're all working at our homes, but we create these additional kind of, environments where we can do that. And I wonder if you've kind of thought about that and what you...
Yeah, no, I have, Venky, quite a lot, and it's a great point. And the way I've thought about it is that certainly in my organization, a large multinational organization, 300,000 people spread around the world, perhaps similar to a lot of other large organizations of people listening right now. We typically, well, certainly pre-COVID, every year, at the end of the year, would have a off-site meeting where the senior people would come together. In our company, it's about the top 2,000 senior people come together, review the year, plan the next year. The real purpose of that get-together is exactly what you say, is to create networks, extend networks, develop the culture, have those sort of casual interactions. I think what we're going to see going forward is that rather than having one global meeting like that every year, we're going to have regional versions of that every month. And so people who are working at home or perhaps going in 1 or 2 days a week, they'll probably have that social, cultural networking thing much more regularly. And again, the role of the office may be, in fact, the showroom, the R&D lab, and actually the party space. We don't need that space to be full of cubicles with people looking down doing their work, because they can do that anywhere. We want that to be, obviously with some social distancing protocols initially, we want that to be a space where people come in and they have exactly that sort of interaction and experience you want. I would hazard a guess that that space going forward becomes a Wi-Fi free space. Leave your computer at home, leave your phone at home. If you're going into that space just to do that, that's not the right use of it. So that's one idea, I think, that we might see, that people use those opportunities to, as you quite rightly say, have that kind of water cooler moment, but have those more frequently in this more kind of fragmented model where it's not just black and white, it's much more kind of fluid.
Great. Okay. And I do have a question for Venky, and hopefully open that.
And maybe I think I just want to add that.
Oh, please. Okay. Late.
Oh, yeah. I just would say, I think I have been working from home for almost 7 months. And I would say that I think that provides people an option now. Previously, I think everybody is expected, I think, to go to office. But now I think it's a large scale experiment for many people, I think for most people, at least in some cases. So that will allow us, I think, to try what works, what I think may not work. So even after the pandemic, I think some of these innovations, some of this kind of new work arrangement may remain, I think, may persist. So that will have some more, I think, broader implication, not only for ourselves, but also for the people, for example, working in the urban area, serving, I think, those commuters, right? That will have a longer and lasting, I think, impact, I think, from my perspective. Of course, for me, I think it's even more productive, I think, I work from home. But for those people, for example, but I make few trips to my office, those people provide service, I think, provide food service, provide commuting service, they may have reduced demand for this kind of service. That will have some implication for these low-wage service workers.
Thank you. Thank you, Lei. In fact, that relates to the question I meant to ask Venky, and hopefully open up for all the other panelists as well. Venky, in your presentation, you mentioned the trade-off between aggressive shutdown versus lax response. And in fact, we see different countries around the world experimenting with a hybrid or mixture or at different stages, different approaches, especially now, this week, just with Europe many countries in Europe going into the second wave or
Right.
second shutdown, lockdown. So according to your study, you're saying that aggressive shutdown will have more longer term economic impact. But then how, for policymakers and for decision makers, how do you make the trade-off between health or lives, saving lives versus GDP, and open to other people's thoughts and contribution as well?
No, that's a great observation. So I agree. I think so. One way to kind of, one perhaps somewhat negative way to present to interpret our results would be to say that these lockdowns have costs that are far greater than previously appreciated because they kind of will spill over into the future. So that's one kind of interpretation, and that's perfectly a valid one. So that kind of tells you perhaps the importance of finding less costly, but perhaps somewhat effective ways of dealing with this. To give you an example, one thing we've all learned, and I was kind of surprised at what Europe is doing right now, because I thought one of the big things we've learned over the last 6 months is the value of really targeted lockdowns relative to blanket lockdowns. And I think somehow, for whatever reason, so I interpret broad lockdown mandates right now as just signaling the seriousness of the problem rather than perhaps thinking about the effectiveness of that. So that's observation number one. So I think one, like this idea of saying it's to push policymakers to come up with, more targeted responses rather than blanket responses. Second, and I think this is my preferred interpretation, there is a way in which, I didn't have a chance to get into this. You could have a combination of an aggressive lockdown and aggressive assistance from the government, which the net of which mitigates the overall economic impact. So it's not the lockdown per se that's leading to scarring. It's the lockdown-induced economic impact that's leading to scarring, right? So you could imagine a situation where every time when we do an aggressive lockdown, we also step up our policy assistance to the affected sectors, so that the net effect is a bit more moderated. So that's how I want to kind of, so it probably has bigger implications for the fiscal side of the equation rather than just the economic side. But I think, you're absolutely right. I think, I myself, I do think that that the longer term effects of the pandemic, or sorry, of the economic kind of shutdown, have largely been kind of ignored in the policy debate. And I think that is something which I do think needs to be kind of put front and center, both in designing the health policy and in designing the economic kind of policy response. So I hope that that helps put it in perspective.
Great, thank you for your answer. I think in practice, many central banks or even leaders around the world, their problem lies in the fact that they lack the data to track and isolate the individuals or specific targeted lockdown areas. That's first. And second, in terms of redistribution or government assistance, sometimes even the money they print the money, but they have a hard time getting the money to those individuals in need. And that's, again, is where the lack of data or lack of timely, real-time, precision data comes into play.
Yeah, so I completely agree with you on that. I think those are real challenges to kind of fully dealing with this. But in some sense, one way to think about this, what our analysis highlights, is the value of trying to deal with those data challenges is huge, because you can really, both you can actually, like, to use the language of this thing, you can actually shift the frontier in your favor, shift the trade-off frontier entirely in your favor. So hopefully, as something that Benjamin alluded to in his presentation as well, part of this is, the way I want to interpret our scarring is, it's not that we think, oh, we're going to get another COVID pandemic again, and that's what people are going to be worried about. It's that people walk away from this recognizing how fragile our systems are. and that stuff happens. And if stuff happens that we didn't really think of and plan for, we are really in a bad position to do this. And I think one kind of positive response this could elude is that, okay, we really need to, just as we do with banks after a financial crisis, we actually think about stress testing systems, stress testing health systems, stress testing economic relief systems in ways that we haven't done before. And that would be, that would go a long way in moderating the scarring effects that we kind of pointed out.
Great, thank you, Venky. And my next question is to both Lei and also Benjamin. Because if we see the pandemic as an external shock to the economy, to people's lifestyles, and how do you, I mean, in one way, the innovations that's happening right now, teleworking, like Lei said, and all these technologies are ingrained in people's habits and daily life now. So maybe this is a good thing in terms of efficiency for society. So how do you trade off? How do you help those fortunate whose jobs are sacrificed along the way? And then how do you take advantage of this opportunity to innovate and continue spur this kind of innovation?
Mm-hmm.
Either one of you gentlemen can.
Yeah, I think the pandemic, provides an opportunity to accelerate the adoption of various technologies, especially the telework and or technology Benjamin just mentioned as well. Of course, this, as you mentioned, it could increase, efficiency and productivity. But of course, it's obviously it has some side effect. And for some workers, for example, even in the US, some workers, they don't have access to broadband, for example. They have difficulty to, to do the remote work. That's, one challenge, especially for small business workers, and also for some, for workers in certain occupations. That's, one side. Those people may hurt, by this trend. Another trend, as I just mentioned, is the telepresence. That may cause, the decline of the urban core, right? And may harm, those people, service workers serving those commuters, to the downtown, right? And that's, and also, the other one is the other trend is the concentration of small businesses. The businesses, to big box stores, because they have the capacity, to do more e-commerce, online sales, and that will create also lots of, has negative effect on the small business as well. So together, all these trends will harm certain populations, and also we notice, generally, those population are already more vulnerable in the labor market, like minorities, like less educated workers, and generally, and in this case, in the pandemic, it's female workers. So all those, so the government, should step in and provide some intervention, to mitigate, this negative effect. Yeah, Benjamin. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just add to that obviously a lot of economists around the world are talking about the K-shaped recovery, and at the heart of that K-shaped recovery is organizations that have taken digitization seriously in the last 10, 15, 20 years, built channels to market, built capabilities for this online world, are doing very well. That's that part of the K. And conversely, organizations that haven't are on that part of the K. And I think you can scale that down to individuals as well. If you live in a zip code full of code, you're doing pretty well. And if you live in a zip code full of coal, as one example, you're probably not doing so well. Of course, if you step back from that, that's the great transformation our societies are going through at the moment. If you buy the argument that this is the fourth industrial revolution, We're 70 years into it. We've probably got another 70 years to go. This is the transformation that we've seen in history. And of course, we all know individually, corporately, societally, that the individuals, the corporations, the societies that have risen through history have done that through education and through their ability to leverage the means of production, the modern tools. Of course, these tools are now literally, physically, and metaphorically in everybody's hands. So we all have access to these tools, but it's how motivated are you as an individual, as an institution, to leverage them to be relevant in the world that we're moving into. And of course, government policy has huge role to play in that in terms of, as was said, broadband, but most importantly, education and making sure that the next generation and indeed current generations are able to keep up, to be in tune with what is going on and where the demand in the marketplace are. And clearly that's going to require a great retooling of a modern tertiary education at the moment, which is increasingly, as your friend Scott Galloway says, Venky, increasingly looking sort of not fit for purpose. And as Clayton Christensen's talking about quite a lot, before he passed away, sadly, that a lot of that educational institutional kind of fabric is really an anchor on real change and really encouraging the sort of change that we're going to need to see going forward. So there's a lot of different aspects to this. It's a very complicated puzzle and it's going to continue to unfurl, but COVID is really kind of nitroglycerin in the middle of all of these trends, and it's accelerating them in a way that's very, very significant, very, very profound, I believe.
Great. Thank you, Benjamin. Mark, I just hope to ask one last question. I know we have 2 minutes left, but this is brought up by Benjamin and everyone else on the panel. The role of the government as this is a common problem faced by the citizens and beyond the borders of a country, the level of trust in the government, the level of the government's ability to control, to track, to mitigate the effects of the viruses. How do you gentlemen see the role of government within society, especially now with the fatigue that people are experiencing from the first wave, going to the second lockdown? Many people are resisting or simply do not wish to follow the new directives from the government. So in terms of the relationship between the government and citizens, any suggestions, any recommendations from you? Anybody?
So I think, at some level, it's like almost a cliche at this point to say, yes, the role of the government has increased, but I think maybe maybe a better statement there is to say, the government needs to make, I think, somewhat more systematic investments in trust and in gaining that trust in a way, I think, because in some sense, in a situation like this, a lot more hinges on the government doing things that are potentially the right things under considerable uncertainty, right? So this is not a situation where everybody knows what is the correct thing to be done and we're just waiting for the government to do this. So I think the structure of the government maybe will become, I think the tension here is trust building is fundamentally a kind of a decentralized local kind of exercise, whereas the kind of decisions we are kind of leaning towards call for more centralization. So ideally, we would move towards a world in which there's greater coordination among governments at lower levels. But I think that might be, on that front, I'm somewhat pessimistic. I don't think we're going to see things get better. I think this is going to become a catalyst for loss of trust in governments more than the other way. But it would be great if that could go the other way. That's one thing where I hope I'm wrong rather than.
Okay, all right. So Mark, on that note, we appreciate all three panelists sharing different the long-term effect of the pandemic from different perspectives, from labor, employment, economic, and also work and lifestyle. So thank you very much for your time and your sharing of your wisdom. I'll turn the